The sound that broke her world wasn't a scream or a crash. It was laughter. A woman's laughter, light and melodic, echoing from the master bedroom she and Rodney had designed together. Dorothy Brown, 7 months pregnant and carrying a bag of organic groceries, stood frozen in the marble foyer of her own home. The scent of an unfamiliar, expensive perfume, something sharp and floral, not her subtle vanilla, clung to the air. Then she saw them, a pair of impossibly high, blood-red stilettos kicked carelessly onto the Persian rug. They weren't hers. And in that silent, suffocating moment, Dorothy knew her life was a lie. The western Massachusetts air was thick with the late August humidity, promising a thunderstorm that had yet to break. Dorothy felt a similar pressure building inside her chest as she pushed the heavy oak door shut behind her. The click of the lock sounded like a gunshot in the cavernous silence, a silence immediately betrayed by another ripple of that musical laughter from upstairs. Her hands, slick with sweat, tightened on the paper grocery bags. Kale, quinoa, prenatal vitamins, the mundane ingredients for a life she thought was real. She set the bags down on the polished granite island in the kitchen, her movements slow, deliberate, as if she were a visitor in a museum of her own life. Everything was pristine. The stainless steel Sub-Zero refrigerator, the gleaming Wolf range, the custom cabinetry that cost more than her parents' first house. Rodney Searles demanded perfection, and Dorothy had, for 10 years, been the perfect curator of his perfect world. Her bare feet made no sound on the cool travertine floors as she moved towards the grand, curving staircase. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the soft, steady rhythm of the baby kicking inside her. Breathe, Dorothy. Just breathe. But the air was too thin, stolen by the woman upstairs. Halfway up the stairs, she heard his voice, low and laced with an amusement she hadn't heard directed at her in years. Easy, Tanya. We have time. She's at her yoga class. Tanya. The name was a shard of glass in her throat. Tanya Dykes, the new VP of marketing at Rodney's private equity firm. Dorothy had met her once at a company gala. She was young, sharp, with a predatory smile and a designer dress that seemed poured onto her body. Dorothy had felt matronly and invisible beside her then, and now she understood why. She reached the top of the stairs, her hand tracing the cool, smooth wood of the banister. The door to their bedroom was ajar. Pushing it open felt like pushing open the door to a tomb, and there they were. Rodney, her husband of a decade, the man whose child she carried, was standing in only his suit trousers, his back to her. Before him, perched on the edge of their bed, was Tanya Dykes, clad in a black silk robe that Dorothy recognized as her own. The red stilettos in the foyer now made a horrifying kind of sense. Tanya was laughing, tilting her head back as Rodney leaned in to kiss her neck. The world went silent. The blood rushing in Dorothy's ears drowned out every sound except the frantic thumping of her own heart. Rodney. Her voice was a rasp, a dry leaf skittering across pavement. It was barely a whisper, but it cut through the moment like a surgeon's scalpel. He froze. His head snapped up, and he turned slowly, his eyes widening in a fleeting expression of panic before settling into a familiar mask of annoyance. It was the same look he gave her when she overcooked his steak, or when a stock he'd invested in dipped by 1/4 of a point. "Dorothy," he said, his voice level, controlled. "What are you doing home so early?" Tanya Dykes slid off the bed, clutching the silk robe tighter around herself. Her face, a mask of expertly applied makeup, showed a flicker of triumph. She wasn't ashamed. She was victorious. "My class was cancelled," Dorothy said, her gaze locked on Rodney. She could feel the baby shifting, a turmoil of limbs mirroring her own inner chaos. Obviously, I should have called first. I seemed to be interrupting. Rodney ran a hand through his perfectly coiffed dark hair. He took a step towards her, away from Tanya, a subconscious act of distancing. Look, Dory, let's not be dramatic. It's not what it looks like. The lie was so blatant, so insulting, it almost made her laugh. Not what it looks like, she repeated, her voice trembling. She gestured with a shaking hand towards Tanya, who was now watching them with a detached curiosity, like a scientist observing rats in a maze. Then what is it, Rodney? What exactly am I looking at? It was a mistake, he said, his tone shifting from annoyance to placating. It was his deal-closing voice, the one he used to charm investors and crush opponents. Tanya was just... We had a stressful week. It meant nothing. It meant enough for her to be wearing my robe in our bed. Dorothy shot back, a surge of adrenaline cutting through the shock. Tanya finally spoke, her voice smooth as polished stone. Maybe you should go, Dorothy. Give him some space to think. The sheer audacity of it stole Dorothy's breath. To be told to leave her own home by the woman sleeping with her husband. Dorothy's gaze swung to her. You will not speak to me. You will get your things, and you will get out of my house. Rodney stepped in between them. Enough. Dorothy, calm down. You're pregnant. You can't get this worked up. He was using their baby as a shield, a tool to manage her. Don't you dare, she whispered, the words raw with pain. Don't you dare use our child to excuse this, to excuse her. It's a fling, Dorothy. It happens. He finally exploded, his frustration boiling over. The charming facade cracked, revealing the ugly entitlement beneath. My God, you act like this is the end of the world. We'll get past it. People do. He didn't understand. He thought this was a line item on a balance sheet, a temporary dip that could be corrected. He couldn't see that he had just taken a sledgehammer to the very foundation of her life. The house, the marriage, the future she was carrying inside her. It was all a house of glass, and he had just shattered every last pane. No, she said, her voice suddenly clear and calm, the eye of her own personal hurricane. We won't be getting past this. She turned, not looking at either of them again. She walked down the stairs, each step a measured, agonizing movement. She picked up her car keys from the bowl by the door, her hand not even shaking anymore. She was numb, a ghost in her own home. Dorothy, where are you going? Rodney called from the top of the stairs. Don't be ridiculous. We need to talk about this. She paused with her hand on the doorknob. She could hear the first fat drops of rain beginning to spatter against the windows. The promised storm had finally arrived. Without turning around, she said, There's nothing left to talk about. She walked out the door and into the rain, leaving the keys to the Mercedes on the porch. She didn't look back. She didn't have a destination. She just knew she could never, ever come back. The life she had known was over. The rain fell in blinding sheets, blurring the manicured lawns and stone facades of Weston into a watercolor wash of greens and greys. Dorothy drove, her hands gripping the wheel of her modest Honda CR-V, the car Rodney called her errand mobile, with a white-knuckled intensity. She had no destination, only a direction. Away. Each mile put between her and the glass house was a small, defiant breath of air in her suffocating new reality. For the first hour, she was on autopilot, her mind a maelstrom of shock and betrayal. The image of Tanya in her robe, of Rodney's annoyed expression, played on a torturous loop. Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the rain on the window she'd cracked open, needing to feel something real. But as the initial wave of grief subsided, it was replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. Dorothy had spent 10 years subsumed by Rodney's life. She'd given up her promising career in art curation to become Mrs. Searles, a role that involved managing 3 properties, organizing charity galas, and ensuring Rodney's life ran with frictionless perfection. She had become an accessory, and like any outdated accessory, she had just been replaced. The power imbalance in their relationship had always been there, a silent undercurrent. It was his name, his money, his world. She had simply been allowed to live in it. Now, cast out, she felt a terrifying, dizzying sense of freedom. He thought she was just a dramatic, hormonal pregnant woman who would drive around the block, cry it out, and come home, ready to talk. He was wrong. Her mind, once occupied with guest lists and dinner menus, began to work with a long, dormant, strategic precision. She pulled into a rest stop on the Mass Pike, the car engine ticking in the sudden quiet. She took out her iPhone, Rodney's face smiling back at her from the lock screen. A photo from Italy last summer. A lie. With a trembling finger, she powered it down. Then, she opened the glove compartment and removed a small, cheap burner phone she'd bought months ago. It wasn't that she had expected this exact scenario, but she had seen the small signs of Rodney's growing detachment, his late nights, at the office, the scent of that same perfume on his suit jacket weeks ago, which he'd dismissed as someone from work. A quiet, nagging instinct had told her to prepare a lifeline, a small act of self-preservation. She had also been quietly siphoning off small amounts from the household account into a separate bank account under her maiden name, Dorothy Brown. It wasn't much by Rodney's standards, just over $50,000, but to her, right now, it was the keys to a new kingdom. She turned on the burner phone and made her first call. It rang 3 times before a calm, familiar voice answered. "Timothy, it's Dorothy." Timothy Johnson had been her best friend in college. A brilliant, kind-hearted history major who had gone on to become one of Boston's most formidable divorce attorneys. They had lost touch after she married Rodney, a drift that Dorothy now realized Rodney had subtly engineered. "Dory, my God, is everything okay?" he asked, his voice instantly laced with concern. The dam broke. The carefully constructed calm shattered, and she began to sob, the ugly, gasping sounds of a heart breaking. "No, Tim. Nothing is okay. I came home. He was with someone. In our bed." She didn't have to say who. Timothy was silent for a moment, letting her cry. There was no pity in his silence, only a deep, anchoring empathy. "Where are you?" "On the pike. I don't know. I just left." "Okay, Dorothy, listen to me. Don't go to your parents. Don't go to a friend's house. He'll look there first. Find a non-chain hotel, something small, and pay with cash. Your iPhone is off, right?" "Yes." "Good. He can track it. The CRV has a GPS locator tied to his security service. We need to ditch it. Tomorrow I'm going to wire you money from a client trust account. You'll use that cash to buy a used car, something forgettable. In the meantime, I want you to go to an ATM, 3 different ones, different banks, and pull out as much cash as you can from that account you have. Then lay low. Don't call anyone but me, and only from this phone. Are you with me?" His instructions were a lifeline in the storm. He wasn't just offering sympathy. He was giving her a plan. He was giving her back a sense of agency. "Yes, Tim, I'm with you." "Good girl," he said softly. "You're stronger than you think you are, Dory. He never deserved you." Meanwhile, back in Weston, Rodney Searles was growing impatient. After Tanya had hastily dressed and departed in an Uber, a slight smirk still on her face, Rodney had paced the bedroom. He'd called Dorothy's phone a dozen times, each call going straight to voicemail. He called her mother, who hadn't heard from her. He checked the tracker on her car, which showed her on the highway, heading west. "Damn it," he muttered. This was more than her usual sulk. It was inconvenient. He had a major merger to close next week. He didn't have time for this domestic drama. He poured himself a glass of Macallan 25, the amber liquid doing little to soothe his irritation. He looked around the silent, cavernous house. Dorothy's presence was everywhere, in the fresh flowers on the mantel, the curated art on the walls, the stack of baby-name books on the nightstand. Her absence was a void, and it unnerved him. He believed, with the unshakable arrogance of a man who had never truly faced consequences, that this was a negotiation. She was raising the stakes. She would eventually call, demand apologies, a ridiculously expensive piece of jewelry, a trip to Paris. He would capitulate, she would come home, and things would return to normal. He would just have to be more careful with Tanya in the future. He sent her a text message, confident it would eventually be delivered. "Dory, this is insane. Come home. We need to be adults about this. Think about the baby." He had no idea that the Dorothy he was texting no longer existed. Miles away, in a dingy motel room smelling of stale cigarettes and disinfectant, that Dorothy was methodically erasing herself. She withdrew cash, her face obscured by a hoodie. She used the motel's spotty Wi-Fi on a burner laptop to close all her social media accounts. She was a ghost, a phantom. She lay on the lumpy bed, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. The baby kicked, a gentle reminder of the life that was wholly hers, the one thing Rodney couldn't touch, couldn't control, couldn't devalue. He thought he had taken everything from her. But as she lay there in the anonymous dark, Dorothy Brown realized she had nothing left to lose. And that made her, for the first time in a very long time, powerful. 3 months passed. The fiery chaos of that August afternoon settled into the quiet embers of a cold, determined resolve. Rodney's initial annoyance had morphed into a simmering rage. Dorothy had not come home. She had not called. The text messages and voicemails, first placating, then demanding, then threatening, went unanswered. Her credit cards were unused. Her bank account was untouched after the initial cash withdrawals. She had vanished as completely as smoke. He hired a private investigator, a former cop with a bulldog face and a hefty price tag. The man, named Peterson, found the abandoned CR-V in a long-term parking lot at a bus station in Albany, New York. The trail went cold there. Peterson assured Rodney that women like Dorothy always surfaced. "They need money, Mr. Searles. They get lonely. They make a mistake. We'll find her." Rodney's life in the glass house continued, but its flawless surface now showed hairline cracks. Tanya Dykes had moved in, her vibrant, modern possessions clashing with Dorothy's classic, understated taste. She filled the closets with her designer clothes and the bathrooms with her expensive perfumes, but her presence felt like a performance. The light, musical laughter that had once seemed so seductive now grated on Rodney's nerves. She was always on, ambitious, demanding, constantly angling for a more permanent position, for the ring, for the title of the next Mrs. Searles. She was a transaction, and Rodney was beginning to feel he'd made a bad deal. The comfortable, seamless ease Dorothy had provided was gone, replaced by a constant, low-level tension. Far from the brittle opulence of Weston, Dorothy Brown was breathing again. She had driven the used 2012 Toyota Camry she'd bought with cash to Asheville, North Carolina, a city nestled in the misty Blue Ridge Mountains. She rented a small, furnished, 2-bedroom apartment under her maiden name, paid the first 6 months' rent in cash, and introduced herself to her neighbors as Dana, a writer on a quiet retreat. Her life was simple, anonymous, and her own. She spent her days walking the winding mountain trails, the crisp autumn air filling her lungs. She discovered a small, independent bookstore where she'd spend hours reading, a cup of herbal tea growing cold beside her. She joined a prenatal yoga class, not the trendy competitive studio she'd attended in Weston, but a warm, welcoming space filled with women of all shapes and sizes. Here, she wasn't Rodney Searle's wife. She was just Dorothy, a woman about to become a mother. Her second bedroom was slowly transforming into a nursery. She painted the walls a soft, buttery yellow herself, bought a simple wooden crib from a local craftsman, and knitted a small, lopsided blanket. Each object was chosen with love, not for its brand name or its ability to impress. This life was authentic in a way her old one had never been. She spoke to Timothy Johnson once a week from her burner phone. He was her anchor, her strategist. He had quietly filed for a legal separation on grounds of irreconcilable differences, serving Rodney at his office. The move was designed to protect Dorothy's maternal rights and a portion of the marital assets without revealing her location. Rodney had been blindsided. The filing, delivered by a stoic process server in the middle of a board meeting, was a declaration of war. He had his own lawyers, a team of sharks from a top Boston firm, file a response, accusing Dorothy of being emotionally unstable, of kidnapping his unborn child. It was a vicious, calculated attack. "Don't let it get to you," Timothy told her during one of their calls. Dorothy was sitting on her small balcony, watching the sun set behind Mount Pisgah, painting the sky in hues of purple and gold. It's standard procedure for a narcissist with a bottomless war chest. They attack, they smear, they try to control the narrative. But we have the truth on our side, Dory. And more importantly, we have a plan. The plan was patience. Dorothy was to remain hidden, establish residency in North Carolina, and build a stable life for her child. The moment the baby was born, they would amend the filing and sue for full custody and divorce on her terms. But the solitude, while healing, was also a breeding ground for fear. Some nights she would wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of Rodney's fury, a tangible presence in the room. She would imagine him finding her, his expensive car pulling up outside her modest apartment building. The power he wielded, the money, the connections, felt like an insurmountable force. She would place a hand on her belly, feeling the strong, steady movements of her son, and draw strength from him. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for him. One chilly November evening, while she was online researching pediatricians, an unfamiliar name popped up in a local Asheville mums group on social media. Tanya Dykes has joined the group. Dorothy's blood ran cold. It had to be a coincidence. There could be hundreds, thousands of Tanya Dykeses in the world. She clicked on the profile. The picture was of a smiling, glamorous woman holding a glass of champagne on a yacht. The profile listed her location as Boston, MA. But why join a group in Asheville? Then she saw the post, made just an hour earlier. "Hi ladies, my partner and I are thinking of relocating to your beautiful city. He's in finance and can work from anywhere. We're looking for a family-friendly neighborhood with good schools. TIA for any recommendations." It wasn't a coincidence. They knew. Or they were close. The PI must have found something. A digital breadcrumb, a whisper. They were hunting her. The quiet sanctuary she had so carefully built was no longer safe. The storm she had outrun was gathering again, right on her doorstep. The digital intrusion felt like a home invasion. Dorothy stared at Tanya's smiling profile picture, the cheerful emoji at the end of her post a mocking grin. It was a probe, a baited hook cast into the quiet waters of her new life. They weren't in Asheville yet, but they were testing the ground, trying to flush her out. Panic seized her, cold and sharp. Her first instinct was to run again. Pack her bags, get in the car, and drive until the town was a speck in her rearview mirror. She stood up, her hands trembling, and paced the small living room. But where would she go? The world suddenly felt small, and Rodney's reach seemed impossibly long. She clutched her belly, the weight of her son a grounding force. No, she couldn't run forever. Running was what he expected. It was the act of a victim. She had spent the last 3 months building a life, not a hiding place. She would not let them tear it down so easily. She picked up the burner phone and called Timothy. Her voice was tight with fear as she explained what she'd found. "Okay, Dory, stay calm." Timothy's voice was steady, a rock in her sea of anxiety. "This is a tactic. They don't have your address. They probably don't even know for sure that you're in Asheville. Peterson, the PI, probably traced an IP ping or a data point to that geographic area. This is a fishing expedition. They're hoping you'll panic and make a mistake." "What do I do, Tim?" "Nothing," he said firmly. "You do absolutely nothing. You don't engage. You enhance your privacy settings, and you go about your life. But you stay vigilant. Lock your doors. Be aware of your surroundings. They've shown their hand." Now we wait. His confidence was a balm, but a seed of terror had been planted. Every unfamiliar car that drove down her street, every stranger's glance in the grocery store, felt like a threat. The peace she had found in the mountains was gone, replaced by a constant, humming dread. Back in Weston, the decision to probe Asheville had been Rodney's, born of sheer frustration. The PI, Peterson, had hit a dead end after finding the car. But a deep dive into Dorothy's old, deleted browser history had revealed searches from over a year ago for best small cities for artists and mountain town retreats. Asheville had been on the list. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead they had. "So you want me to just have your girlfriend join a mummy group?" Peterson had asked, his tone skeptical. "Mr. Surlees, that's not exactly standard procedure." "Just do it," Rodney had snapped. "Dorothy is predictable. She'll be looking for a community. She'll be nesting. If she's there, she'll see it. It might spook her into making a move." Tanya had been thrilled with the assignment. It made her feel like a partner in Rodney's quest, not just a live-in girlfriend. "Don't worry, Rod," she'd said, curling up next to him on the sofa that Dorothy had chosen. "We'll find her. And then you can finally put this all behind you, and we can move on with our life." But their life was unraveling. The novelty had worn off. Tanya's ambition, which had once seemed exciting, was now exhausting. She constantly talked about the future, marriage, a ring, their own children. She was trying to fit into Dorothy's life, but the fit was all wrong. One evening, during a tense dinner, Rodney, distracted by a business call, had unthinkingly said, "Could you pass the salt, Dory?" The silence that followed was deafening. Tanya's fork clattered onto her plate. "What did you just call me?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "It was a slip of the tongue, Tanya. For God's sake." "It's been months, Rodney. She's gone. Why is she still living in your head?" Tanya stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "I'm not her replacement. I'm not a placeholder you keep around while you obsess over your runaway pregnant wife. You need to choose. It's her or it's me." The ultimatum hung in the air. For a fleeting moment, Rodney felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. He was tired of Tanya, tired of the lawyers, tired of the search for Dorothy. He just wanted his quiet, orderly life back. He realized with a startling and unpleasant jolt that the peace he craved wasn't just an absence of conflict. It was the specific absence of conflict that Dorothy had so expertly managed for him. He hadn't just lost a wife. He'd lost his anchor. Weeks later, in the sterile, quiet environment of an Asheville hospital room, Dorothy's world shifted on its axis. After 12 hours of grueling labor, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Ethan. Ethan Brown. Holding him for the first time, his tiny, wrinkled body warm against her chest, Dorothy felt a love so fierce and protective it eclipsed every other emotion. The fear, the anger, the betrayal, it all faded into the background. Looking into her son's deep blue eyes, she knew she wasn't a victim anymore. She was a mother, a warrior. The moment she was discharged from the hospital, she called Timothy. "He's here, Tim," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she gazed at Ethan sleeping in his car seat. "He's perfect. Congratulations, Dory," he said, and she could hear the genuine joy in his voice. "I'm so happy for you. Are you ready?" "Yes," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength. "Let's do it. Let's end this." The very next day, a process server walked into Rodney Searles's gleaming Boston office for the second time. He handed a stunned Rodney a new set of documents. They were not a response. They were an offensive, a petition for divorce on the grounds of adultery, a request for an emergency hearing to establish paternity, and sole legal and physical custody for Dorothy. Attached was a copy of Ethan Brown's birth certificate and a restraining order application, citing Rodney's increasingly aggressive behavior and use of a private investigator as harassment. Rodney stared at the papers, his face turning a dark, mottled red. The name Ethan Brown leaped off the page. Brown. She hadn't given him his name. She had erased him completely. This wasn't the frightened, emotional woman who had run out into the rain. This was a calculated strategic assault. She wasn't hiding in a corner, waiting to be found. She was on the attack. The power imbalance he had relied on his entire life had just been turned on its head. And for the first time, Rodney Searles felt a sliver of genuine fear. The legal documents landed on Rodney's antique mahogany desk like a declaration of war. His initial shock quickly hardened into a cold, seething fury. Sole custody, restraining order, harassment. The audacity was breathtaking. He had spent a fortune on the best legal team in Boston, and they had been outmaneuvered by Timothy Johnson, a man he vaguely remembered from Dorothy's college photos as a soft, intellectual type. "This is an ambush," he snarled into the phone at his lead attorney, a slick corporate lawyer named Marcus Thorne. "How did they get the jump on us like this? I'm paying you $700 an hour to be proactive." "They were patient, Rodney," Marcus said, his voice a calm counterpoint to Rodney's rage. "They waited until the child was born in North Carolina, establishing jurisdiction there. It's a smart move. It forces you to fight on their turf. And this adultery claim, do you have any exposure there?" Rodney thought of Tanya, who was at that very moment directing painters in what used to be Dorothy's home office, turning it into a garish pink dressing room. "It's a he said, she said situation," he lied, the words tasting like ash. "I hope so," Marcus said dryly, "because if they have proof, this custody battle gets exponentially harder for you. The judge won't look kindly on it." The battle lines were drawn. Rodney's legal strategy was to paint Dorothy as an unstable, vindictive woman who had fled her marriage in a fit of hormonal rage and maliciously kept a father from his child. They filed motions demanding a psychological evaluation for Dorothy and immediate DNA testing to establish paternity, framing it as a necessary step due to her erratic behavior. In Asheville, Dorothy read the filings with a knot of ice in her stomach. The words were a vile caricature of the truth, twisting her desperate act of self-preservation into a portrait of mental illness. "This is what they do," Timothy reassured her over the phone. He had flown down to meet with her and her new local counsel, a sharp, empathetic family lawyer named Sarah. They throw mud, hoping some of it will stick, but we have something they don't. The truth. And we have proof. The proof was a simple, devastating thing. The day Dorothy had left, after Rodney had gone downstairs to see Tanya out, Dorothy had instinctively gone back upstairs. In a daze, she had seen Rodney's laptop open on his desk. On the screen was his calendar. Open to that day was an appointment. 2 p.m., Tanya. But it wasn't the appointment itself that was damning. It was the fact that it was a recurring weekly appointment, stretching back 6 months. With a trembling hand, she had taken her old iPhone, the one she would later abandon, and taken a clear, time-stamped photograph of the screen. It wasn't just a one-time mistake, as he'd claimed. It was a long-term, calculated affair. "We hold on to this for now," Timothy advised. "We don't play our best card at the beginning of the game. Let him build his fortress of lies. We'll knock it down when it matters most." The preliminary hearing was scheduled to take place via video conference, a cold and impersonal forum for such a deeply personal war. Dorothy sat at the polished table in Sarah's office, Ethan sleeping peacefully in a carrier at her feet. She wore a simple navy blue dress, her hair pulled back neatly. She looked composed, a stark contrast to the unhinged woman described in Rodney's legal filings. On the large screen, she saw him for the first time in nearly a year. He looked thinner, his face etched with lines of stress and anger. He sat in a high-tech conference room, flanked by Marcus Thorne and 2 junior associates. He refused to look at her, his gaze fixed stonily on the judge's image at the top of the screen. The hearing was a brutal, clinical dissection of her life. Rodney's lawyer painted her as a flighty, emotional housewife who had abandoned a loving, supportive husband. They presented her disappearance as proof of her instability. When it was Sarah's turn, she spoke with a calm, methodical precision. "Your Honor, my client, Ms. Brown, did not abandon her marriage. She fled a toxic and unsafe environment for herself and her unborn child. She left her home on August 28th of last year after discovering her husband, Mr. Searles, in the marital bed with his subordinate, Ms. Tanya Dykes." Rodney flinched on screen, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. Marcus Thorne immediately objected. "Objection, Your Honor. These are unsubstantiated and inflammatory allegations." "On the contrary, Your Honor," Sarah continued smoothly, "we have evidence that Mr. Searles was engaged in a long-term affair with Ms. Dykes, evidence we are prepared to present at trial. My client left to protect her child from the emotional distress of a volatile situation created entirely by Mr. Searles." The judge, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, peered over her glasses. "Mr. Searles, is it true that Ms. Dykes is currently residing with you in the marital home?" Rodney hesitated. Marcus whispered something in his ear. "Yes, Your Honor," Rodney said through gritted teeth. "She is a colleague who was in a difficult housing situation. I was offering her support. The lie was so pathetic, so transparent, that Dorothy almost felt a flicker of pity for him. He was a king with no clothes." The judge's expression was unreadable. "The court orders a DNA test to confirm paternity immediately. A guardian ad litem will be appointed to represent the interests of the child, Ethan Brown. Ms. Brown will retain temporary sole physical custody. Mr. Searles, given the circumstances and the distance, you are granted 2 hours of supervised virtual visitation per week. We will reconvene in 90 days to review the findings." It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. They hadn't fallen for his lies. As the video conference ended, Rodney's image lingered on the screen for a moment before blinking out. For the first time, his mask of controlled fury had slipped, replaced by a look of pure, undiluted shock. He had used his power and money to bully and control everyone in his life. He had just discovered they were useless against the simple, unassailable weapon of the truth. Tanya was waiting for him when he got home. "Well, what happened?" "She has temporary custody," he spat, throwing his briefcase onto a chair. "I have to see my son. My son, on a damn webcam with a court-appointed babysitter." "They can't do that," Tanya said, her voice rising. "You're his father. You have rights." "My rights," Rodney said with a bitter laugh, "are currently being dictated by the fact that the judge knows you're living here. My lawyer thinks your presence is complicating the narrative." The implication was clear. She wasn't an asset anymore. She was a liability. The triumphant victor who had watched Dorothy leave in the rain was now just another problem for Rodney Searles to manage. The foundation of her new life, built on the ruins of Dorothy's, was beginning to feel terrifyingly unstable. The 90 days leading up to the next hearing were a brutal war of attrition. Rodney's legal team inundated Timothy and Sarah with discovery requests, subpoenas, and depositions, a strategy designed to bleed Dorothy dry, emotionally and financially. They subpoenaed her college transcripts, her old employment records, even the prenatal yoga instructor in Asheville, looking for any scrap of information they could twist into a sign of instability. But Timothy had prepared her for this. Dorothy's life was an open book, and it was a book filled with quiet competence and stability. She had a master's degree in art history. Her old boss at the museum provided a glowing reference. Her neighbors in Asheville described her as a kind, devoted mother. The mud Rodney slung refused to stick. Meanwhile, the court-appointed guardian ad litem, a thoughtful and experienced social worker named Mrs. Gable, conducted her investigation. She interviewed Dorothy at length in her small, sunny apartment, observing her gentle, attentive interactions with Ethan. The home was modest but clean, safe, and filled with love. Her video conference with Rodney was a different story. He tried to charm her, presenting himself as a heartbroken father, desperate to be a part of his son's life. But Mrs. Gable was trained to see past such performances. She noted his repeated attempts to steer the conversation toward Dorothy's faults, his dismissive language when talking about the affair, a momentary lapse in judgment, and his visible frustration when discussing the supervised virtual visits. Those visits were an agony for everyone involved. Ethan, just a few months old, would often cry or sleep through them, while Rodney sat stiffly in his office, trying to engage with a baby on a screen. "Look, Ethan, it's Daddy," he'd say, his voice hollow. Dorothy had to remain present but out of frame, her heart aching for her son, who deserved better than this sterile, court-ordered parody of a father-son relationship. Back in Weston, Rodney's world was shrinking. The legal bills were astronomical, even for him. But more damaging was the slow leak of information about his messy divorce into his professional circle. Whispers followed him at the country club and in the boardroom. A man who couldn't control his own house, his own wife, was perhaps not as infallible as he seemed. A major investor pulled out of a new fund he was launching, citing concerns about instability in senior leadership. Tanya, feeling the walls close in, grew more desperate. "You have to do something, Rod," she'd insist. "You have to fight harder. Why are you letting her win?" He saw her then for what she was. Not a partner, but an echo of his own worst impulses. Greedy, entitled, and transactional. She wasn't a comfort. She was a constant, nagging reminder of the single stupidest mistake of his life. The breaking point came a week before the final hearing. Timothy called Dorothy. "It's time," he said. "We need a keystone, something to make their entire case crumble." Dorothy knew what he meant. For years, as the manager of the Searles household, she had been responsible for organizing all their financial documents for their accountant. She was meticulous, keeping digital and physical copies of everything. One year, She had noticed a strange recurring wire transfer of $100,000 every quarter to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands called Searles Strategic Holdings. When she'd asked Rodney about it, he'd been uncharacteristically vague and angry. "It's complex investment stuff, Dory. You wouldn't understand. Don't worry about it." Sensing his agitation, she hadn't pushed, but she had made a copy of the statements, filing them away with a vague sense of unease. She had given that file to Timothy months ago. His forensic accountants had been quietly digging ever since. Rodney has been systematically hiding marital assets in that offshore account for the last 5 years, Timothy explained. It's a classic case of financial fraud against a spouse. But it's worse than that. The source of the funds is questionable. It seems to be linked to an insider trading investigation the SEC has been sniffing around for the past year. If this information were to be shared with, say, the U.S. Attorney's Office, he let the implication hang in the air. This was the keystone. This wasn't just about adultery or custody anymore. This was about Rodney's freedom. Timothy Johnson requested a settlement conference with Rodney and his lawyer. They met in a neutral conference room in Charlotte. Dorothy was not present. Timothy would be her sword and shield. Timothy laid it out. Not with malice, but with cold, hard facts. He presented the photograph of the calendar, proving the long-term nature of the affair. He presented the glowing report from the Guardian ad litem. And then he slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was a bank statement from Searles Strategic Holdings. Rodney's face went pale. Marcus Thorne looked at the statement, then at his client, his eyes narrowing. "Here is our settlement offer," Timothy said calmly. "Dorothy gets sole legal and physical custody of Ethan. Rodney gets supervised visitation in Asheville 4 times a year at his own expense. He will pay a substantial, fixed amount in child support until Ethan is 21. In addition, Dorothy will receive 50% of all declared marital assets. In exchange for her signature on this agreement, that file," he tapped the bank statement, "remains a private matter between us." It was checkmate. Marcus Thorne looked at Rodney, whose arrogant facade had completely crumbled. He was a cornered animal. "Take the deal, Rodney," the lawyer advised in a low voice. Rodney left the conference room a broken man. He drove back to Weston in a daze. When he walked through the front door, Tanya was there, a glass of wine in her hand. "How did it go?" she asked, a hopeful lilt in her voice. "It's over," he said, his voice flat. "She won. She won everything." He slumped onto a sofa, the fight gone out of him. He looked at Tanya, at the pink dressing room down the hall, at the life he had chosen. It was all a cheap imitation, a hollow prize. Tanya stared at him, at his defeat. She had hitched her wagon to a star, and the star was falling from the sky. There would be no ring, no Mrs. Searles title, no access to the limitless funds she had dreamed of. He was damaged goods. Without a word, she turned and walked upstairs. An hour later, she came down with 2 suitcases. She didn't look at him as she walked to the door. "Where will you go?" he asked, the question devoid of emotion. "Don't worry about me," she said, her voice hard. "I always land on my feet." She walked out the door, leaving him alone in the vast, silent glass house, a king in a kingdom of one. The laughter was finally gone. The divorce was finalized on a crisp, clear day in early spring. The paperwork, signed and sealed, felt less like an ending and more like a quiet, formal beginning. Dorothy sat in Sarah's office, the pen feeling light in her hand. There was no triumph, no desire for revenge, only a profound sense of peace. She had not destroyed Rodney. His own choices had done that. She had simply refused to be a casualty of his wreckage. The settlement was more than generous. It wasn't about the money itself, but what it represented: security, independence, and the freedom to give Ethan the life he deserved, a life built on a foundation of honesty and love, not glass and lies. A few weeks later, Rodney came for his first supervised visit. The meeting was at a neutral location, a bright, cheerful family center in Asheville. When Dorothy walked in, holding Ethan, she saw Rodney waiting with the court-appointed supervisor. He looked diminished. The bespoke suit hung a little looser on his frame. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a hesitant uncertainty. He looked at Ethan, who was now nearly a year old, a happy, gurgling baby with a shock of dark hair like his father's, and Dorothy's calm blue eyes. Rodney's face, for the first time, showed a flicker of something beyond anger or self-pity. It was a raw, aching regret. He's beautiful, Dory, he stammered, his voice thick. His name is Dorothy, she corrected him, gently but firmly. She handed Ethan over. Rodney held his son with an awkwardness that broke her heart a little. He had missed it all. The first smile, the first laugh, the sleepless nights, the tiny miraculous moments that forge the unbreakable bond between a parent and child. He was a stranger to his own son. She watched for a few minutes as he tried to play with Ethan, the supervisor looking on with a practiced, neutral expression. She saw the ghost of the man she had once loved, and the man he had become. He was no longer a monster in her mind, just a sad, flawed man who had broken the most precious things in his life. She walked over to him before she left. I hope you can be a good father to him, Rodney. He deserves that. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a galaxy of unspoken things, apologies, questions, regrets. I know, he whispered. I'm sorry, Dorothy, for everything. The apology, when it finally came, felt distant, like a message in a bottle that had washed ashore long after the ship had sailed. She didn't need it anymore. Goodbye, Rodney, she said, and walked out into the sunshine, feeling nothing but light. Her redemption wasn't in his downfall, but in her own rise. She bought a small house with a wide porch and a view of the mountains. She started a small online art consultancy business, helping clients build their own collections. Her old passion, so long dormant, bloomed anew. Her life was filled with the quiet joys she had once craved. Ethan's laughter echoing through the house, the smell of paint and old books, the steady, comforting presence of good friends from her yoga class, the breathtaking beauty of a mountain sunset. She had walked out of the glass house with nothing but the clothes on her back and the child in her womb. She had been stripped of her name, her home, her security, but in losing everything, she had found herself. She was not Mrs. Dorothy Searles, the millionaire's wife. She was Dorothy Brown, a mother, a businesswoman, a survivor. She had faced the storm and walked out the other side, not just intact, but stronger, truer, and finally, breathtakingly free. Dorothy's story is a powerful reminder that the end of one chapter is often the beginning of a truly authentic life. She lost a marriage built on lies, but found a strength she never knew she possessed. Her journey from a shattered wife to a resilient, independent mother shows that our greatest trials can forge our greatest triumphs. It's a testament to the fact that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in peace, self-respect, and the courage to build a future on your own terms. What did you think of Dorothy's incredible transformation? Could you have found the strength to do what she did? Let us know in the comments below. Her story is one of betrayal, but ultimately of profound redemption and the quiet victory of a life well lived. If you were moved by her journey, please give this video a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and be sure to subscribe for more true-to-life stories that touch the heart. Thank you for watching.